November 8, 1519, 600 men in iron armor walk onto the great causeway of Tenochtitlan. They carry steel swords, crossbows, crude firearms, and the unshakable belief that God has sent them to claim a continent. Behind them were 16 horses, animals at this point in history no one on this side of the ocean had ever seen. Ahead of them was a city of 200,000 people, larger than Paris, larger than London, larger than anything Europe had built since Rome fell. The bridges were raised, the causeways were sealed, and over the next 2 days, the Lake of Moon turned red. The Battle of the Causeway is one of the most decisive engagements in military history, not because of its scale. By European standards, the numbers were modest, but because of what came after, because the empire that won that battle went on to reshape the entirety of the Western Hemisphere. This is the story of how the Aztec Federation grew to become the most powerful nation in the Americas, and it starts with a single moment, the single military decision that would change the course of the 16th century. November 1519, the state of the Mexican Empire before the Spanish arrived. There was the Triple Alliance, Tenochtitlan, Texcoco, and Tlacopan. They controlled central Mexico through a combination of military dominance, tributary extractions, and ritual warfare. The empire held somewhere between 5 and 6 million subjects. Tenochtitlan itself sat on the island in Lake Texcoco, connected to the mainland by 3 engineered causeways, fed by aqueducts, organized by perfected canal systems that made Venice look embarrassing. But the empire had enemies. The Tlaxcalans to the east had resisted the Aztec expansion for decades. Smaller states chafed under its tribute demands. The system worked through fear and obligation, which can never stand for very long. When small fleets of Spanish ships appeared off the Gulf Coast in April 1519, led by a minor nobleman named Hernan Cortes, the Tlaxcalans saw an opportunity. They allied with the foreigners, so did other discontented tributaries. Cortes marched inland with 600 Spaniards and several thousand indigenous allies, believing he had found the cracks in the empire. And he had. Huey Montezuma had a brother named Cuitlahuac, and Cuitlahuac saw something Cortes did not, except anyone would notice. The traditional account drawn from the Codex Cuitlahuac and corroborated by the Texcoco annuals records the exchange that changed history. Montezuma wavered. The strangers had technology that no one had seen. Animals that carried men, tubes that spat fire and smoke, and armor that turned obsidian blades. Advisors whispered these might be emissaries of Quetzalcoatl. Montezuma considered diplomacy, gifts, buying time, but Cuitlahuac said no. The exact words vary by source, but the Codex Cuitlahuac gives the famous version. They bleed, they die from arrows. They are 600 in a city of 200,000, and the lake is a trap. Let them walk in. Montezuma agreed. The Spanish were welcomed onto the causeway with ceremony and gifts. Cortes believed he was being received as the dignitary. His Tlaxcalan allies were directed to camp outside the city, separated from the main force. Then the bridges were raised. The first wave hit at dusk. Canoes filled with warriors sealed the lakes on both sides. Atlatl darts and arrows rained from elevated positions. The Spanish horses, terrifying on open ground, were useless on the narrow causeway, stumbling and panicking in the confined spaces. Firearms cracked and boomed in the darkness, but they took agonizingly long to reload, and every flash of powder gave the Aztec archers a target. The Spanish fought hard. Steel armor saved lives in the first few hours. Obsidian blades shattered against breastplates, and the crossbowmen cut down dozens of attackers from behind the makeshift barricades. And by midnight, Cortes had pulled his surviving men into a tight defensive formation near the center of the causeway, surrounded on all sides by water and warriors. But there was nowhere to go. By dawn, the lake was thick with canoes. Fresh warriors rotated from the city, while the Spanish, exhausted, out of powder, bleeding from hundreds of wounds, could only watch the sunrise over the city that they would never leave. The collapse came on the second morning. A coordinated push from both ends of the causeway broke the Spanish line. Some men threw themselves into the lake. Their armor pulled them under in seconds. Others surrendered. A few fought to the last sword and stroke. Roughly 400 Spaniards were captured alive, but the rest, maybe 200 who stayed with the ships off the coast or fought through the chaos on the mainland side, fled east, eventually reaching the coast and sailing for Cuba with stories that would terrify Spain for generations. The Tlaxcalan's allies scattered, but they didn't simply disappear. Some melted into the countryside, others regrouped in their home territory, fortifying their cities, calculating their next move. They had bet against the empire and lost. They knew what was coming, but the Tlaxcalans were not a people who surrendered easily. That problem would take years to solve, and we'll get there in a minute. Over the following 6 days, the captured Spanish soldiers were marched up the steps of the Great Temple. Cortes himself was offered to Huitzilopochtli on November 14, 1519. His heart, according to the code of Cuitlahuac, fed fifth son so that it would not falter. It was brutal, but it was by Aztec theology necessary. And it sent a message that echoed across 2 continents. This empire does not fall. The victory on the Causeway solved one problem. The next one was invisible. It was nearly the thing that destroyed the empire. Smallpox arrived with the Spanish. Within weeks of the battle, warriors who had grappled with the conquistadors began to sicken. Then their families, then their neighbors. The disease moved through Tenochtitlan like fire through dry grass, faster than anyone could track, killing people who never touched a Spaniard or stood anywhere near the causeway. Cuitlahuac, now effectively co-running alongside a shaken Montezuma, ordered quarantine measures. Anyone showing symptoms was isolated. Entire neighborhoods were sealed off. The sick were moved to islands in the lake where food was delivered by boat, and no one was permitted to leave until the fever broke, or they did. But it wasn't enough. It couldn't have been enough. Smallpox does not wait for quarantine orders. It spreads before the symptoms appeared, carried by breath and touch, and no population in the Americas had ever encountered it. The death toll in central Mexico over the following 5 years was staggering. Somewhere between 1.5 and 2.5 million people, roughly 30 to 40% of the population in the hardest hit areas. Entire towns went silent. The labor force that maintained the chinampas, the floating gardens that fed the capital, was gutted. Famine followed plague in the terrible years of 1521 and 1522, and yet the empire survived. And that survival is what separates this history from the counterfactual nightmares that scholars sometimes model. Scenarios where unchecked plagues kill 70-80% of the population, and the political structure simply disintegrates into history. The quarantine did not prevent the catastrophe, but it did slow the spread enough that the political and military infrastructure was able to hold together. Cuitlahuac's government continued to function. The army, though depleted, remained organized. The tributary system, battered, strained, and renegotiated under desperate pressure, did not collapse. But 1530, the worst had passed. The population was devastated but recovering, and the empire, forged in plague and war, had become something harder and more centralized than the loose tributary network that existed before the Spanish arrived. The Tlaxcalans knew they were next. After the Battle of Causeway, the Tlaxcalans' leader faced an impossible choice: submit to the Aztec Empire that now had Spain's weapons and a burning desire for revenge, or fight. They chose to fight. It was brave. It was also ultimately futile, and it took decades. The Tlaxcalans' war dragged from 1520 to roughly 1535. The Tlaxcalans were fierce, organized, fighting on home terrain. They fortified their mountain cities, they conducted raids, they formed brief alliances with other resistant states, and for 15 years, they held the eastern frontier, a grinding, bloody stalemate that cost Aztecs military dearly. But the numbers were ultimately insurmountable. By 1535, the last major Tlaxcalan strongholds had fallen. The survivors were absorbed into the empire, though absorbed is really a polite word for what actually happened. The Tlaxcalan nobles were stripped of titles. The Tlaxcalan identity didn't disappear. It went underground, where it would simmer for centuries before finally being stamped out. The Maya regions to the south were a different kind of problem. The Aztecs pushed into the Yukon and Guatemala through the 1540s and 1550s, but the Mayan city-states were decentralized, spread across difficult jungle terrain, and experienced a resisting centralized authority. Full incorporation of the Maya South wasn't achieved until the 1570s, and even then, the southern provinces remained semi-autonomous, still paying tribute but governing their own affairs. Think of it less as a conquest and more as a negotiated absorption that took 60 years and never fully settled. Meanwhile, the weapons question was evolving, but slowly in the 1520s and 1530s, the Aztecs fought primarily with captured Spanish arms. Steel swords were prized trophies, the handful of working muskets were reserved for elite units. But replicating European metallurgy proved far harder than anyone anticipated. The Aztecs had no tradition of ironworking, no blast furnaces, no understanding of fuel requirements for smelting iron ore at scale. The captured Spanish blacksmiths, perhaps a dozen men who had chosen conversation over sacrifice, could repair and maintain existing weapons. But building a steel industry from scratch was a generational project, not a wartime improvisation. By the 1540, Aztec smiths were producing rough iron tools and simple blades, brittle but functional, and by the 1560s, small-scale steel production had begun. Supported by charcoal furnaces in the forested highlands, the industrialized metallurgy, reliable steel weapons, cannon foundries, standardized production wouldn't arrive until the early 1600s. And the horse breeding program followed a similar arc. Of 16 horses Cortes brought, only 12 survived the battle. Horses are not an easy animal. They require specific feed, veterinary knowledge, and a careful breeding to maintain a viable population. Early mortality was high, but the military invested heavily establishing royal breeding farms in the Valley of Mexico. By the 1550s, cavalry units were operational. By 1600, horses were common enough to transform agriculture and transport across the whole empire. And yet, Spain did not give up easily. In 1532, a second expedition, larger, better armed, arrived at the Gulf Coast expecting to find the same Stone Age empire Cortes had described in his letters home. But what they found was organized resistance. The Aztec coastal garrison engaged from prepared positions, not with muskets, not yet, but with captured crossbows, Spanish swords, and vastly superior numbers. The shore defense were built with European-style fortification principles. Studied from captured engineering texts, the Spanish ships withdrew without even establishing a foothold. The commanders reported back to King Charles described a kingdom transformed and recommended against further attempts without a far larger force. A third expedition in 1548 met similar results, this time facing actual gunfire from shore batteries again, crude but functional. The message from the empire was becoming unmistakable. Over the following decades, Portuguese, French, and English ships probed the coastlines. Some established trading posts in the Caribbean and along the northern Gulf, but central Mexico, the heartland, remained untouchable. The Aztec Navy, such as it was, developed slowly. Coastal defense cannons and gallery patrolled the Gulf shoreline, and by the 1560s, enough to harass European ships, not enough to project power across the oceans. True deep-water naval compatibility wouldn't come until the mid-1600s, built on decades of studying captured European ship design and eventually hiring renegade European shipwrights who saw opportunity in a rising global power. Europe eventually got the message. The riches of Mexico were not available for the taking, and this had consequences far beyond Mexico. The period from roughly 1600 to 1750 is known in the Aztec historiography as the Fifth Sun Resistance, the area when the empire transformed from a regional military power into a genuine civilization state with global reach. The captured European texts, Bibles, navigational charts, engineering manuals, philosophical texts had been studied at the great Calmenek schools since the 1520s, but it took generations for that knowledge to bear fruit. Nahuatl scholars translated Latin and Spanish works. They adopted what was useful and discarded what was not, and by the early 1600s, a generation of Aztec engineers, metallurgists, and navigators had been raised on a hybrid curriculum. Traditional knowledge fused with European technical insights. The wheel, known in Mesoamerica for centuries, but never scaled for transport, was finally engineered for roads. A highway system connecting Tenochtitlan to the coast was completed in stages. It happened between 1519 and 1640. Steel production was industrialized by the 1620. Cannon foundries supplied both coastal defense and the expanding army. But the most consequential development was maritime, and by the 1650s, Aztec shipyards on the Pacific coast were producing ocean-going vessels, not as large or refined as the European galleons, but seaworthy and improving with every generation. In 1668, the first documented Aztec trading fleet crossed the Pacific and reached the Philippines. There, Aztec merchants encountered Chinese and Southeast Asian traders for the first time. Direct trade was established. Aztec silver, cochineal dye, and cacao for Chinese silk, porcelain, and spices. The Pacific became an Aztec trade route. No European middleman, no colonial markup. And by the 1700s, Tenochtitlan's population had recovered and grown. Estimated ranges from 600,000 to 800,000, making it one of the largest cities in the world. The Great Temple had been expanded 3 times. Markets sold goods from 3 continents. Nahu was becoming a trade lingua franca across the Pacific Rim. And yes, the flower wars continued. Human sacrifice persisted, though at reduced scale and increasingly debated with the Aztec intellectual circles. The theological framework evolved, but the core belief held. The 5th sun demanded blood to keep rising, and whether that was literal or increasingly symbolic depends on which priest or which politician was speaking. The sun still demanded blood. The empire still provided it, but the conversation about what that meant was changing. By 1800, the geopolitical map looked nothing like the European theorists had predicted. The Aztec Empire stretched from Panama to the northern frontier, modern Texas, New Mexico, and the California coast. A centralized bureaucracy administered dozens of ethnic groups and languages, all under the authority of Cuitlahuac and the Imperial Council. The southern province, the Maya territories, remained semi-autonomous, a source of both cultural richness and period political tension. The south, across the Darien Gap and the Inca Empire, had survived its own European encounter. Inspired by the Aztec success and warned by Aztec diplomats, the Incas had repelled Francisco Pizarro's expedition in the 1530s. Though their own plague years had been devastating, 2 great American empires now faced each other, rivals, trading partners, and mutual guarantors of hemispheric independence. Europe, meanwhile, was weaker than it might otherwise have been, but not toothless. Spain, denied the rivers of gold and silver that might have flowed from America's conquest, never achieved the continental dominance it sought. The Spanish Armada still sailed in 1588, driven by European religious politics and Philip II's ambitions. But it was a smaller and less lavishly funded fleet, and it lost. Without wealth from the New World to rebuild like it had hoped for, Spain's decline was steeper and faster, but Spain remained a significant European power, diminished but not destroyed. The English colonies on the Atlantic coast did eventually declare independence in 1783 as it happened, but the American Republic was a constrained state. Western expansion was blocked by indigenous nations to the northwest and the Aztec Empire to the south and west. The land beyond the Appalachians was contested, negotiated, and fought over, but never taken so easily. The United States, such as it was, had roughly 8 million people in 1800. The Aztec Empire had over 35 million. Today, the Aztec Federation is constitutional monarchy, reformed in the 1830s after a series of political crises that nearly tore the empire apart. Cuitlahuac retains ceremonial and limited executive authority. Real power sits with the elected federal council and the provincial governors. The Great Temple still stands. It has never been destroyed, never been buried, never been built over. Sacrifices ended officially in 1847 following the reform of the 5th sun, a political and theological movement that reinterpreted the solar obligation as metaphorical rather than literal. The temple remains the most sacred site in the Federation. Tourist access is heavily restricted. Nahuatl is spoken by roughly 200 million people as a first language, one of the most widely spoken languages on Earth. Quechua, The Inca lingua franca adds another 100 million in South America. The Western Hemisphere's dominant languages are indigenous, though English, Spanish, French, and Portuguese all persist in their own respective coastal footholds. Christianity is about 15% of the Federation's population, concentrated in the southern provinces where Spanish missionary influence was strongest before the borders hardened. But the majority of people practiced evolved forms of Mesoamerican religion, now formalized into institutional structures with seminaries, published theological works, and vigorous internal debate. The theological arguments are fierce, ongoing, fascinating, but that is another episode entirely. The United States has roughly 180 million people, concentrated on the eastern seaboard, Great Lakes region, and parts of the interior plains. They're a prosperous democracy, a significant regional power, but it shares a continent with a neighbor 4 times its age and twice its population, and that makes the calls. Trade, policy, military posture, cultural identity. The Aztec Federation has problems. Every great power does. Economic inequity between the Valley of Mexico and the outer province is severe. Corruption in the federal council is an open scandal. The Maya South still pushes for greater autonomy. Some say even independence. Religious conservatives argue the reform of 1847 was a betrayal. The northern frontier territories chafe under centralized rule. Relations with the Inca Federation cycle between cooperation and rivalry. It is a complicated and messy living situation, like all of them are. But here is what you have to remember. 600 men crossed that causeway in 1519. They carried weapons no one had even seen. They carried diseases no one could survive. They carried the absolute certainty that they were designed to conquer. And they died on the lake, not because they were weak, not because their technology failed, but because one man, Cuitlahuac, looked at the situation clearly and said things that needed to be said. They, the enemies, are only human. They bleed, they die, and there are 600 of them, and 200,000 of us. The plague that followed nearly finished what the Spanish set out to do. The empire cracked and groaned under the weight of it. There were years when it was not at all clear that the Federation's ancestors would survive, but they held. They adapted, they buried their dead and rebuilt their cities and studied the weapons of the men who had tried to destroy them. And they turned those weapons outward. 500 years later, the Great Temple still stands. Nahuatl is spoken on 4 continents. The 5th sun still rises over the city and has been continuously inhabited for 700 years. History is not a river flowing in one direction. It's a series of decisions made by specific people at specific moments. Montezuma could have hesitated longer. The bridges might not have been raised. 600 men could have become 6,000, then 60,000, and then unstoppable wave. The continent could look very different. The world could look very different. But the 5th sun still rises.